Well, Theodore H. Kattouf, President and CEO of AMIDEAST since 2003, is a former U.S. ambassador to Syria and to the United Arab Emirates. He has been a career Foreign Service officer since 1972. His Foreign Service assignments included Deputy Chief of Mission in Damascus, Riyadh, Baghdad, and Sana'a. He was Deputy Director and subsequently Director for the Office of Lebanon, Jordan, and Syrian Affairs. In earlier posts, he was a State Department mid-career fellow at Princeton University. He worked as an international relations officer in the Near East Bureau. He served as a Middle East analyst, attended the Foreign Service Arabic language program in Beirut and Tunis before being assigned as a political officer to Damascus, and served in Kuwait as an economic and commercial officer. He received the Cobb Award for outstanding advocacy efforts on behalf of U.S. companies abroad, 2 Meritorious Honor Awards, 4 Senior Performance Awards, 1 Presidential Honor Award. He was named runner-up as DCM of the Year in 1996. Born in Pennsylvania, upon graduating from Penn State University in 1968, he served for 3.5 years in the U.S. Army Infantry, attaining the rank of captain. Kattouf and his wife, Jeannie, are the parents of 1 daughter and 3 sons and the proud grandparents of 4 boys. As I mentioned, we're very grateful for our friends, the Wheatley Institution, to help in coordinating the visit of Mr. Kattouf to campus. Today's topic, Syria's Nightmare, Decades in Making, Years Before Waking. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Theodore Kattouf.
Thank you, Dr. Leonard. I'd like to thank the Kennedy Center for having me. It's a real pleasure to be at BYU. I congratulate all of you on your financial acumen, because I read a financial magazine the other day, and 50 best private colleges and universities, and of course BYU was on it. But only BYU had the distinction of being the best value for the money. So you've already shown that you make good choices. I realize that the speech I have today is overly long. Dr. Fred Axelgard, I think, led me to believe I was getting paid by the word. So I'm going to, rather than go through especially the beginning of the text, I'm going to ad-lib a lot here in order to try to keep this more brief. But while at lunch some time ago, attended by several of my former U.S. Foreign Service colleagues, one of whom I'd worked for and respected, this gentleman told our Israeli guests that day that it was quite predictable that the Arab people would explode onto the streets against their dictatorial governments. You could see it coming, my former colleague remarked. I held my tongue, but I wanted to blurt out, come on, when did you or anyone else see this coming? Where's the articles? Where's the academic articles in academic journals and the like predicting this great Arab second awakening? It reminded me of the saying that economists had predicted 10 of the last 6 recessions. But in any case, it's true that those of us who worked on the Arab world were generally well aware of the pent-up popular frustrations and the poor records of the regimes that claimed to govern the populace. Yet these same regimes had been in power often for over 40 years or more, largely following the same policies and practices. They trumpeted security and stability as their virtues, and did not say much about the price at which those virtues came. Challenges to their rule during those 40 years had been few and far between, not to mention short-lived. You see, these regimes had become quite adept at coup-proofing themselves. They created overlapping and redundant security and intelligence services, all competing with one another, none of them talking to each other, but all of them reporting to the leader or his most trusted family members. Meanwhile, these family members were appointed to sensitive positions and allowed to profit from their offices and their connections, as were other non-family loyalists who had proven themselves. Thus, since the 1970s, few threats existed to the entrenched regimes, and almost none came from within the ranks of their militaries or security and intelligence services. Nevertheless, there is almost nothing that these regimes feared more than prolonged, large, widespread demonstrations and rioting. Knowing that their police forces might not be able to restore order, they would then face the unpalatable choice of going to their militaries and asking them to fire upon their fellow citizens. In these countries, during these 40 years, there were secular liberals, human rights activists, pro-democracy advocates, but they did not enjoy strong followings, and thus they were easy for the regimes to silence, either by co-optation, intimidation, or even torture and imprisonment. The only organized opposition in most Arab countries were Islamists. The most disciplined groups with the most committed followers were able to survive, often despite being outlawed. The followers of these Islamist groups often endured torture and years of imprisonment. Some were even executed or died in prison of mistreatment. Some of these groups came to denounce violence, such as the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and were tolerated to a certain degree, while other groups remained officially proscribed. If you were even a member of these proscribed groups, you could be subject not only to imprisonment, but possibly to execution. This was the case in Saddam's Iraq, and also the case in the Assad's Syria. Sadat, of course, was assassinated by violent Salafist extremists, one of whose members was the notorious al-Qaeda leader, Ayman al-Zawahiri. Nouri al-Maliki, the current Prime Minister of Iraq, belonged to an underground Shia party called, an underground Shia party, Dawa, which means the call. Many of whose members were executed by Saddam prior to the US invasion that deposed him. Despite the regime's efficient and ruthless state security organs, popular frustrations were building up for years, aided and abetted by a huge youth demographic. In most Arab countries, you will be safe if you say 50% of the population is under 20 years old and 2/3 are under 30 to 35 years old. Having a large population can lead to an explosion of economic growth or just to explosions, depending on how they're dealt with and accommodated. Unfortunately, another trait of most of these Arab regimes was that while they put a fair amount of resources into education, into public education, and improved literacy and the like, nevertheless, the school system seemed intent on producing obedient, well-disciplined citizens who gave due respect to authority. A great deal of rote learning and teaching to the tests occurred and still occurs. Inquiry, critical thinking, and discussion in the classroom were the exception rather than the rule. In general, Arab societies instill deference to authority figures and are characterized by paternalism. This is true in the home, in schools, in the mosques or the churches, and ultimately, obviously, the government. The idea being that, this authoritarian model should produce citizens who are pliable and obedient. Obviously, something went wrong, but it worked. Let's give them their due. It worked for a long time. The brash, brave, and innovative young people who organized the initial demonstrations in Tunisia and Egypt didn't foresee the degree to which their efforts would come to benefit some of the more authoritarian and reactionary opposition movements in their countries. And here, of course, I speak first and foremost of the Muslim Brotherhoods, which goes under the name of Al-Nahda in Tunisia, and of course the Muslim Brotherhood of Mohammed Morsi in Egypt. Although neither Tunisia nor Egypt are known as hotbeds of the more extreme forms of Islam, they both had well-organized, highly disciplined Muslim Brotherhood parties that were prepared to mobilize their supporters behind their candidates for the constituent assemblies and interim parliaments that were being formed. Now, why am I telling you all this? Essentially because I think it's interesting to look at why did Egypt and Tunisia go in one direction? By that I mean, why did Ben Ali end up rather quickly going into exile in Saudi Arabia? Why was Mubarak forced to resign and then subsequently imprisoned and indicted and maybe still being tried? We don't know. And why did Syria turn out to have a civil war? And that's what I really want to highlight with you this afternoon. I served at the U.S. Embassy in Syria on 3 separate occasions, including in the 1970s, the 1990s, and at the beginning of this new millennium as the U.S. ambassador. Historically, and maybe we could have a slide that shows, maybe I have the, okay, can we see the, so, you know, historically, Syrians believe that their country was carved up by colonialists. They all have a sense that Syria should have been a much larger country than what we see in the dark green on the map. They believe that Lebanon, parts of Jordan, Israel, which was then Palestine, and even that finger of land coming down from Turkey into Syria, that coastal area where the ancient city of Antioch is and the port of Alexandretta, should have all been Syrian territory. So Syrians tended to have a sense that they had been victimized by the colonial powers, by the British and the French after World War I. And so there were two, during the brief period where Syria enjoyed sporadic democracy in the 40s and 50s, there were alternating periods of coups and free elections. You had 3 parties that were not wedded to democracy, that were competing for power among the military and the civilian populace. And these were authoritarian parties. One was the Communist Party. Another was the Syrian Social National Party, which was a pan-Syrian party, not a pan-Arab party, but the pan-greater Syrian party, although they even claim Cyprus as part of Syria. I don't know that the Greeks and Turks there particularly felt the same. And then finally, you had the pan-Arab Ba'ath Party, preaching Arab socialism, a renaissance of a new Arab man, and the like. So Syria was constantly rent by turmoil in the 40s and 50s, and there was clashes in the streets, there were assassinations, there were coups and counter-coups, people went into exile, and the like. And now I'd like to understand what's going on in Syria, I am going to give you a little bit of context here. I'd like the next slide, which should show the composition, right there. The composition of Syria is very important to know if you want to understand what's going on today in what is a sectarian civil war. Almost 60% of the country, and the majority, are Sunni Arabs. That is the mainstream form of Islam. Not necessarily a very extreme brand of Sunni Islam practiced by most Syrians, far from it. And then you have the Alawites, who dominate the army and the security services, the sect from which Hafiz al-Assad came, and his son, of course, Bashar al-Assad. They were the most persecuted minority in Syria historically, particularly under Ottoman rule. They lived up in the coastal mountains of Syria because mountains are where persecuted minorities in the Middle East took refuge, Maronite Christians in Lebanon, Druze along with them, and Alawites in the coastal mountains of Syria. Then you have the Alawites are a very far offshoot of Shia Islam. You have the Druze, another very heterodox sect comprising 3% of the Syrian population. The Druze are generally found only in Syria, Lebanon, and Israel. You have Christians, some of the most ancient Christian communities on the face of the earth. Remember, St. Paul was Saul on his road to Damascus when he, I'll leave the theology to others, but I think you know the story. And became St. Paul. Well, that was Syria. You know, he was on the road to Damascus. So you have 10% Heinz 57 variety of Eastern Christians. And then you have about 5% of the population who are Shia Ismailis. And then you have another group that is not religiously distinct, but ethnically distinct, the Kurds, who comprise, they're generally Sunnis, but they're Kurds, not Arabs. They have their own language, their own culture, and they tend to be concentrated in the northeastern part of the country. Now, how did the Alawites come to be such a dominant player within Syria, particularly over the last 50 years or so? Well, when the French and the British carved up the Middle East, the French got what is today's Syria and Lebanon as the territories they were supposed to mentor into statehood and democracy and the like, even if they had other motives as well. The Sunni Arabs and indeed most Syrians did not want to serve in the French officer gendarmerie. So it was sort of a police force, militia force to keep law and order. So the Alawites, this very persecuted minority, the French went to them and promised to give them a certain amount of autonomy in their mountain homeland, et cetera, and recruited them into positions as non-commissioned officers, just regular privates and the like, within this gendarmerie. So from the early 1920s until independence in the mid-40s, the Alawites got a leg up on every other group in terms of military training, the discipline, and it was a ladder of upward mobility for a group that was very impoverished. It gave them higher status within society. So when independence came, and schools opened to train officers, the Alawites were, again, the most represented group going to officer training schools, that they had already been in the military. They knew what the military life was all about. And as one coup and another took place in the 40s, 50s, and into the early 60s, one or another group within the military would be cashiered. And often it would be a group of Sunnis, and then it would be a group maybe of Druze and some Christians. And so finally, in the early 60s, it was Alawite faction versus Alawite faction. And indeed, Hafiz al-Assad, who had been Minister of Defense in a regime led by another Alawite, General Salah Jadid, overthrew Jadid in November 1970. And he held, and his family has held power ever since. So that's how the Alawites achieved these positions. And then, of course, Assad made sure that he put loyalists into the aforementioned security, intelligence units, the elite military units, special forces, Republican guards, and the like. That doesn't mean that there were not non-Alawites in the military. Of course there were. And sometimes they were in senior command positions. But you could almost bet that if a Sunni was in a senior command position, his deputy was an Alawite, who was the guy with the real power and the ear of those around the president. So let's fast forward to what's going on. Bashar al-Assad is now, of course, president. Hafiz al-Assad died in June of 2000. He had intended for his eldest son, Basil, to succeed him. Basil was a dashing figure, and I mean that sincerely. He was a champion equestrian. He was an adventurous man. He liked to drive fast cars. He liked it when his father would give him an assignment to go and crack down on one group or another. He was a self-styled tough guy. But he died, I believe, 1993, when he was driving a sports car to the airport far too fast. It flipped over a number of times, and he was killed. His brother Bashar was doing a medical residency to be a ophthalmological surgeon in London. I hate that word. He'd only been in London about 15 months. So those who think that Bashar is this fellow who's been Western educated and very highly exposed to Western culture, A, doesn't understand the fact that he only was in London a short time, and B, doesn't know what a medical residency is all about, because I'm sure he had very, very little time to do anything but report to the hospital and sleep. Anyway, Bashar came back. His father, according to Bashar, asked him if he wanted to continue with his medical studies or if he wanted, my words, not his, to go into the family business. Bashar chose the family business. He had 7 years to learn from his father. Could we slide up maybe 2 slides there, Fred? I think one more. There we go. No, one more. Sorry. Well, I say one more. I'm trying to get to the 7 rules for keeping Syria in check. Okay, here we go. So, according to a recent article I read by an Israeli academic, these are the 7 principles that Hafiz al-Assad tried to instill in his son. And I didn't put them up there because I think necessarily the Israeli academic has this from a totally reliable source and you can believe each and every word of this. I put it up there because it made sense to me. It's what I know about the ruling style of the Assad family. So, maintain and strengthen ties with allies, in particular Iran and Russia, and we see the value of that today. Safeguard Syria's role as the champion of Arab nationalism. I would put it coded to that, except when it's not convenient to do so. Do not provoke Israel directly. Let Hezbollah do that. Maintain a dominant role in Lebanon and support Hezbollah. Certainly the young man has carried that out. Play one sect against another, both in Syria and Lebanon, while sparing the Alawites. Number 6, select nearly all party military security and intelligence elites from the Alawites. And 7, and this one is probably the most violated, be benevolent while never tolerating challenge to the regime and crushing any uprising. The be benevolent part is the part that got ignored. The tolerating, never tolerating challenges, that's pretty much observed, I think we can say. So, as I said, I think that is a good explanation of the governing principles. In my talks, I cannot resist comparisons to the famous novel by Mario Puzo, The Godfather. Of course, it was turned into a compelling film trilogy, although you can skip the 3rd one. But my take is that Bashar al-Assad is Michael Corleone, the Michael Corleone of Syria, because this is a mafia regime in so many aspects. The son who was going to make the family proud by showing he had the skills to pursue a prestigious career outside of governance of Syria was, of course, Bashar. He was going to be a surgeon. He was going to show a different face of the Assad family to the Syrian people. But he got pulled in when Basil, or Sonny as I like to call him, was killed in a car accident being reckless, which Sonny, of course, was. Like Michael, Bashar thought he could take the family semi-legitimate. He thought he could reform some practices when he came to power in Syria, allow some more openness, improve education, improve the administration of the country, privatize some state industries and the like. But his father's stalwarts and advisors are reputed to have intervened to school him on the limits of such initiatives, and very soon a crackdown occurred. The experiment in 2001 was never tried again. So Bashar, as Michael Corleone, came to understand that if he wanted to hold and keep power, he would have to adapt to the family's ruthless system rather than trying to bend it to his will. He wasn't a very confident fellow when I knew him in the first couple years of his rule as U.S. ambassador. He was, I don't mean to suggest he was a wilting, I'm sorry, I don't mean that he was shy or lacking totally in confidence, but he was not the Bashar he is today. And I would have never guessed that he would become as brutal as he did. But his confidence tended to increase during the presidency of George W. Bush, because a lot of the neocons around the Bush administration had loose lips. They wanted Syria to be next after Iraq. George W. Bush had no intention of taking on that task, but I'm not sure Bashar ever understood that. And so he was being isolated after, I guess, his own St. Valentine's Day massacre, the killing of former Prime Minister of Lebanon, Rafik Hariri, on February 14, 2005. The Bush administration moved to isolate him internationally as much as they could and force him to withdraw Syrian forces from Lebanon. Perhaps a high watermark in our treatment of Syria during George W. Bush's administration. But of all things, he managed to break the blockade on Syria by establishing a relationship of trust and confidence with Prime Minister Erdogan of Turkey. And Turkey helped to serve as a bridge for Syria to break out of its isolation. Rather ironic now when you hear how Erdogan speaks about Bashar al-Assad and the regime there. But Bashar then went almost in the other direction. He started to see himself as a gifted international strategist who knew best what his people needed. A formerly self-effacing young man had now acquired quite a bit of hubris. I would refer you to a Wall Street Journal interview Bashar gave to the Wall Street Journal's Jay Solomon in January 2011, in which he dismissed any thought that the uprisings in Tunisia or Egypt could spread to Syria. He followed those statements in the interview by condescendingly stating that the introduction of democratic practice required a long period of dialogue with and among one's people, and that the Syrian people were a long way from being ready for democracy. Less than 2 months later, the citizens of the impoverished southern border town of Daraa came into the streets to protest the arrest of their teenage boys for scrawling graffiti, anti-regime graffiti across the town, and the harsh treatment that they were being subjected to. The regime quickly turned to lethal force, arrests, torture, and mass punishment to make an example of the town and to deter others from joining. In the past, this would have worked, but this time, obviously, it did not. Even as the Daraa protests were being put down, there were uprisings in other major populations in Syria, the midland cities of Homs and Hama, and even the coastland city of Latakia that was close to the Alawite heartland. Most knowledgeable observers never expected to see such courageous and sustained resistance in Syria because it had remained passive in the face of previous provocations. Clearly something had changed, most probably the zeitgeist, following what Syrians could see on their readily accessible satellite channels of Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya. Meanwhile, camera phones and internet-savvy young people ensured that the evidence of the regime's brutality reached the outside world and through satellite channels were beamed back into Syria. It's been clear for some time that we are in a sectarian civil war situation. Civilian fighters, many of whom have had military training, have been joined by defecting soldiers. Most military resistance is being locally coordinated. Makeshift clinics have sprung up after the regime began to kill and arrest those in hospitals being treated for their wounds. Small unit militias began to pick off regime convoys, checkpoints, and a shadowy militia called the Shabiha, which literally means ghost-like, generally Alawite and Christian thugs who terrorized Sunni populations. But unfortunately, along with Bashar's brutality came an influx of jihadists from outside of Syria. And they were very adept at recruiting many young Syrians to their ranks. Indeed, a couple of these groups currently pledge allegiance to al-Qaeda, and they are among the most effective, best armed, best financed parts of the opposition. These groups have a very narrow-minded and distorted interpretation of Islam, which revolve around the strict segregation of the sexes, the domination of women by their husbands or close male relatives, the expulsion or extreme marginalization of not only religious minorities, but fellow Sunnis who do not adhere to their practices and belief. And they believe that coercive violence in pursuit of their agenda is sanctioned by God, the most dangerous thing possible. They seek to go back to a time in early Islam that never was. In their view, Shia Muslims are heretics and Alawites are infidels. Christians are fair game, even though they're supposed to be, like Jews, people of the book and thus protected by Islam. As a result, for both sides, this conflict has become existential. Neither side believes it will survive a victory by the other. And that explains, to some extent, the absolute ferocity of the warfare going on and the brutality and the take no prisoners policies of both sides. Facing an enemy that potentially has most of the country's population to draw upon for recruits and support, morale among the military and security units was plummeting as they found it harder and harder to control territory and protect themselves from their comrades. You know what? I see it's growing. I'm going over time already. So let me get down to the nitty-gritty and just see if I can explain it in a few minutes here. There are no good choices for the United States in this war. This conflict does not have, in my opinion, any near-term solution. As I said, it was decades in the making. There was all these pent-up frustrations. It's not that Syrians were a violent people. I never found them to be, and I lived among them for 7 years. It's not that there was outright hatred of the other, of different sex intermingled, they intermarried, they did business together. But I don't know, there are now atavistic impulses at play, and everybody's going back to their core identity, and even those of goodwill are either leaving the country or being forced to support a militia whose beliefs they may not adhere to. The Free Syrian Army is a loose grouping of disparate militias with disparate beliefs. They're not a coherent force, and they often have to join with these al-Qaeda-like groups in joint operations against the Alawite-dominated army. I think it was a mistake for President Obama to call for the ouster of Assad without having a plan to accomplish it. I think it's hurt our credibility in the region. It also probably was a mistake to declare a red line on chemical weapons if you weren't prepared to use force when that red line was crossed. We faced the embarrassing predicament of having Putin have to bail out U.S. policy. And so while we will get chemical weapons largely destroyed or out of Syria, it's going to be at a high price because, in a sense, we're depending on Assad to fulfill the agreement. So it almost gives certain assurances to Assad that we're not going to seek regime change because we really can't. Finally, Assad saw, and the Russians saw, that the U.S. president did not have the support in Congress or among the Arab American people for even a very limited military strike on Syria. So how much less do the Assads and the Russians have to worry about a full-scale American intervention, although I hasten to add that nobody, including Senators Lindsey Graham or John McCain, are calling for boots on the ground. The jihadists, if they emerge, the ascendant party in the opposition, what incentive do they have to come to the table? Why would they come to a negotiating table? Why would they go to a Geneva II? In fact, they've said, we will not do such. Because if they carve out a de facto state, you know, the emirate, if you will, of Syria and Iraq, there are resources there, there's population there to be ruled, and it's a base of operations like they've never had any place, including in Waziristan and Afghanistan. They're right, you know, they neighbor Turkey, Jordan, Iraq, Lebanon. And, you know, Lebanon and Iraq have the same ethnic and sectarian fissures that Syria does. So we really don't have any good choices in this conflict. We need to do all we can on a humanitarian basis to help the Syrian people. Over 7 million people are refugees or displaced persons. We need to continue diplomacy, even though it may at times look fruitless. We may be able to get some relief for people, ceasefires, humanitarian assistance to isolated populations, the ability of civilians to get out of areas that are being shelled and the like. And we can do what we can with our allies, Turkey, Jordan, to try to insulate them as much as possible from the spillover from the Syrian conflict. But in truth, neither the United States nor the Europeans have the ability right now to step in and influence in any great measure the course of this conflict, or to bring about what we all would like to see, a democratic, pluralistic Syria that respects its people's human rights and that is at peace with its neighbors. So I'm going to stop there and take any questions that you might have.
We have a microphone here if you want to queue up there for the recording. Tell us your name and ask your question. And as always, the bravest, smartest person always goes first. So take a run for it.
Hello, yeah. My name is Jay Pooley, and my question is dealing with like the end result of the Syrian conflict. You said that no short-term solution is in sight, and the last lecture we had on Syria, they kind of talked about how it could go either way, and you also said that either side kind of believes that they won't survive a win by the other side. So in your opinion, kind of from what you think, which way do you think it would go? Is the scale completely equal, or is it like towards the rebel side or towards the Assad side?
I think we're heading for a military stalemate. I don't
Yeah.
think the Alawites are only 12% of the population. I don't mean to suggest that they're the only ones who will fight for Assad.
Yeah.
Some other groups will hold their nose and fight for Assad as well. But at the end of the day, the minorities in the military don't have the wherewithal to take back North Syria. Maybe we could get the first slide up again for it. Or, I'm sorry, third slide, I think, has who's where in Syria right now. Yeah, right there. So, you know, right now, the regime dominates the area more or less from Damascus down here up through Homs and Hama and over to the coast. But the area up there by Aleppo in the north, the Turkish border, the Euphrates Basin, is dominated by various opposition groups. I don't think as long as Assad has his air force and heavy weapons, I don't see that he is going to be driven from power. He might lose some ground, but he's not going to be driven from power.
Yeah.
And even if he's killed or leaves, others will replace him. at the same time, as I said, the manpower doesn't exist among the army, et cetera, to take back the north and east. So what we might see is a stalemate. And what the one hope I could see for a settlement, the Russians do not want a jihadist regime in Syria. We do not want a jihadist regime in Syria. So it's always good to start with your adversary by figuring out what you agree upon. And I think we both can say we agree upon that. And then, okay, how do we prevent that? Well, we need a stronger Free Syrian army to confront the jihadis, and we need the Alawites to admit that they have to share power with other groups, and that Bashar, at some point, and his family have to go.
Okay.
I don't know whether they have to go to trial, but they have to go. And if you could get more respectable elements of the military in the opposition, maybe conducting back-channel negotiations prior to a Geneva, et cetera, we might get somewhere, but we're not close to that yet, in my opinion.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
My name is Justin Cheng. I'm a political science student here. Just a quick question. What do you believe the responsibility of the international community toward the situation in Syria to be? Beyond this conflict between the United States and Russia over intervention or non-intervention, what do you think, just from the standpoint of the United Nations, how should the international community be treating this conflict, and what should it be doing, if anything?
Well, as I said, massive humanitarian assistance is needed, more than just, food and tents and water and medical supplies. There are millions of Syrian children who are not getting an education right now. The schools in Lebanon, the schools in Jordan, they can't cope with this. They can hardly educate their own populations, let alone take on these Syrians. And the international community is not doing enough in this regard. We need more NGOs involved. We need more funding. It's not that the U.S. isn't giving money. I'm guessing, I don't have the figure, that we may have given by now in the last 2.5 years $1 billion or over $1 billion. But this is a crisis of epic proportions, and far, far more is needed. The UN needs to, I think, continue to outline a framework of what we want to see in Syria. I hope that the diplomat deputized by the UN Secretary General, the Algerian Lakhdar Ibrahimi, will stay with his mission, but he's an old man. I think he's getting very tired, and he might resign. I don't think the U.S. is the world's 911. I don't think it's fair to keep asking our military to get involved in Middle East conflicts where there are no clear objectives, where the end state, whatever it is we want, it's not clear how you would bring it about, where there's no U.S. public support for the policy. I think I've just named 3 of Colin Powell's 4 rules for military engagement. And nor do I think, and there's no exit. There's no exit strategy. That's 4 for 4. So I got it. So, there's, unfortunately, I think right now we're limited in what we can do. We want to work with the Lebanese, the Turks, the Jordanians, even the Iraqis as much as possible to try to, I say, limit the spillover effects. But we might be the world's only superpower, but we're not all powerful. And we're not, what we can do, we need to be humble. Once George W. Bush said we needed a more humble foreign policy. That's when he was debating Al Gore for your time. And I would agree with that. We need a more humble foreign policy.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Randall Bentley, and I have a question about some of the implications of the civil war in Syria on neighboring countries, particularly Lebanon. As we've seen in the past few months, there's been a lot of sectarian violence, especially in northern cities such as Trablus. And so I'm just curious, as to what extent do you believe that countries such as Lebanon can maintain a semi-stable government in light of all the refugees and also tension and also smuggling of weapons and people and everything going across their borders?
It's frightening. I don't know. I'm not even sure I'd agree with the characterization that the government now is semi-stable because we have an acting prime minister. The president, Michael Suleiman's term is up in 2014. God knows how elections are going to get done and organized. Hezbollah as you indicate, there's fighting up in Trablus between Sunnis and Alawites there. Hezbollah is going into Syria and supporting the Alawite-dominated army. Sunnis are going into Syria and supporting the opposition. So they're literally fighting, Lebanese are literally fighting each other on Syrian soil. And it's inevitable, I think, that some of that fighting is going to end up occurring in the Bekaa Valley and other areas where Shias and Sunnis, radicals, come into contact with one another.
Do you believe that more southern places in Lebanon, such as Beirut or even in southern parts of Lebanon, will still manage to stay out of it as opposed to the border regions?
You know, the
that
Lebanese
mentioned?
are very resilient people, very resourceful people. I don't think Hezbollah wants a civil war in Lebanon right now. Most Lebanese don't. Some jihadi groups might, but most people don't. I think Lebanon is just going to be in a muddle-through mode. It'll be unstable, unsafe, but it will, the business community will, and bankers will keep it functioning. But I don't think they're going to see much tourism.
Okay, thanks.
Can you tell us what AMIDEAST is, its goals right now with possibly Syria or the Middle East?
Well, we used to run English language training programs and exchange programs in Syria, help select Fulbright scholars and the like. All those programs are suspended. The U.S. government has not approached us about working in the refugee camps in terms of, you know, scholarships, and maybe on a very minimal scale, maybe a Fulbrighters and the like. But I think it's something, you know, if we weren't in the midst of a budget battle and sequestration, I think people at the State Department would maybe be much more forward-leaning in trying to come up with programs to bring more Syrians to this country for higher education and exchange programs and the like. The problem is, I'm not sure that you could send them back once they get here.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.